Great. Well, let's get started. Welcome to the session, and please feel free to come down to the front seats here, because there are 4 or 5 different sessions going on at once. So we'd welcome you down the front as you're assembling. And just as a reminder for people, this is the session, where do the real leadership opportunities lie for SDGs and health? As we begin, of course, acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands we're on here today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And we greatly value the care for country from traditional owners here in Naarm over millennia. Of course, that's very relevant to the theme of this particular session, because what we're really talking about is advancing the well-being of people and planet for current and future generations. And where should health be framed in that? Both during this phase, the phase of the International Development Programme, the SDGs, and also potentially beyond, where we're going to be starting to lift our heads up and look beyond 2030. We still want to accelerate our action on the SDGs, but we also must start lifting our heads up. I'm Tony Capon. I'm the director of the Monash Sustainable Development Institute and Professor of Planetary Health in the School of Public Health and Preventive Medicine here at the university. I'm co-chairing this session with Ilona Kickbush, and we've got a terrific panel assembled today, including Yodi, who's just off a plane and was to have been on the earlier session this morning, but the change of schedule meant she couldn't be. So their loss was our gain, Ilona. It's terrific to have Yodi with us. So the process will be very conversational. That's why we're not starting up at the podium there. We're all together. And we'll allocate about the last half an hour, for questions and answers from participants. So as we proceed, please think about those questions and be ready to put your hand up and go to the microphones. So of course, we're well into the SDGs now. And later this year, the UN Secretary General is convening the Summit of the Future. And indeed, the focus of that summit is around multilateralism, international cooperation, and global solidarity. For those of you that have already looked at the Zero draft of the Charter of the Future, you would likely have seen that there's very little attention to human health in the Zero draft. So that's lots of fodder for our discussion here today. So shall we, Ilona, invite the panelists just to introduce themselves, and then we'll end up back with you.
Well, you know, I thought the panelists would introduce themselves as we call on them. Okay. Otherwise, we have this long row of things. So I think that makes it a bit livelier. A very nice welcome to all of you. I'm Ilona Kickbush. I'm the co-chair of the World Health Summit Council. And I'm delighted to be able to co-chair here with Tony. We've had some pre-discussions and we've asked our panelists to very shortly introduce themselves, you know, what part, because they're all such busy people, all of them do 20 different things at least. So if, you know, they focus on what part of what they do actually also has very high relevance for our discussion here. You heard the SDGs are moving on. To some extent, if we look back at the Millennium Development Goals, and we got the Sustainable Development Goals, many of us were quite thrilled because we felt And all of you are familiar with the famous circle, that we are getting an approach that is getting away from individual categorized issues, particularly as far as health is concerned. It was then many health actors that felt, well, out of 17 goals, health should probably have gotten more than one. So that was another issue, and not all of us were also completely satisfied with how or what was packaged under the SDG 3. So we thought we'd first turn to Anders Nordström and then to Yodi Arakija to give their perspective on have the SDGs actually fulfilled our expectations, both in terms of how we do health and policy, but also in terms of outcomes, because we know from the recent human development reports that in many areas we're actually moving backwards. And actually the data show us that one of the areas that's progressed least has been UHC. So why is that? Anders, you're one of the most experienced health diplomats on this planet. What's your view?
I'm not sure about that, but thank you. I was just thinking about the ring or the beautiful brooch that you have, Ilona, today. So if you really would like to have the SDGs like Ilona have got them, look at what Ilona has got. You were saying that people were quite happy when we moved from the MDGs to the SDGs. I was co-chairing together with the government of Botswana 2012 and 13 the thematic consultations, what should be the future goal after the MDGs. And we had a big meeting in Botswana in March 2013, and we presented a report that laid the foundation to the goal that we have today. I'm saying that some people were not happy because out of the MDG agenda, we had 3 goals focusing on health: reducing child mortality, maternal mortality, and then the spread of AIDS, TB, and malaria. And the leadership for that at that time was extremely strong, and we made huge progress. So when we began that sort of work, or that work started with the MDGs, 20 million people were dying. Now it's down to 8 million people. So big progress. And then people, I would say, were quite disappointed that we only got 1 goal. And this is where I think we got it wrong. We haven't got 1 goal. We have a construction here of 17 goals that is quite innovative and not just quite, it's very different from the MDG construction. Both because those are goals that are aiming at something that is broader than just sort of delivering on one specific diseases or health challenge. So the present SDG 3 is about maximizing healthy life expectancy and well-being, meaning that it's focusing on health, living long and healthy lives. And if you internalize what that means, is that it's not enough with health service and the health sector, what the health sector is doing. You need basically to get the other goals also to be part of this equation. So where we need leadership for health, it's not just from health. It's leadership from clean energy, it's leadership from gender equality, it's leadership from the climate agenda, etc. The difficulties here with this agenda is that then we are going to get the climate people actually to contribute to health without using the H word, but still visualizing the health impact. And I think that's part of the construction here that we are still challenged with. So I'm not so worried that we are not mentioning health in the report for the Summit of the Future, because we need also to have a clear and good and correct understanding what is really health and what is influencing people's health. Because the big health challenge today, it is the remaining 8 million people that are dying prematurely because of the MDG goals or agenda, but we also have now 18 million people dying prematurely before the age of 70 of NCDs. Diseases that the global health community is not basically dealing with today. And if we're going to deal with those, again, then we need to engage the other goals, not the health goal. Final comment is that a problem I have with the construction is that the 13 targets that we have under this broad goal, which is about maximizing health life expectancy, are still very old-fashioned. It's the old health sector targets. So I'm much more keen not in some way to work on those targets, but rather to engage and work with the leaders and the leadership for the other SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you, Anders. And that's a really, really important perspective, because also then, particularly if our starting point is from the determinants of health, and if I just take one determinant, the commercial determinants, then, for example, it's SDG 12 that becomes absolutely central in terms of sustainable production and consumption. So I think also to some extent us health people, if I can put it that way, have not been creative enough in actually fully exploiting the potential that the SDGs have actually laid at our feet. So Jodi, from your perspective, what has your experience been? What do Global South leaders say about the SDGs? How do you think the Summit for the Future could make a difference?
Thank you, Ilona, and thank you to everybody for having me here. I'm sorry to be arriving hot off a plane today, and also my thanks to the traditional owners of the land on which we stand today. You asked, the initial question was how satisfied are we with what was packaged under SDG 3, and I would say that the wider question for me is how satisfied are we with the SDGs generally, because I agree, I align with what Anders said in terms of health, SDG 3 as one thing. The SDGs are about health holistically. And I think if we start as a health sector, start to see that poverty, climate, education, it's all about health. You asked us to introduce ourselves, which I'm not going to bother to do. But how do we relate to this topic? And so I sort of thought in a panic, because of course I found out 40 minutes ago I was going to be on this panel. So I thought, how do I relate to this topic? And I remember that in 2010, I was in Rwanda advising the president of Rwanda, the government on Rwanda, 2007, 2008, 2009, on achieving MDGs 2015. Reaching MDGs 2015, preventing maternal and child deaths. That was the goal, that was the focus. I spent the earlier part of my career here in the Pacific, leading health and development for UNICEF out of the Fiji office for the region, working also then on the early versions of the MDGs and working on HIV/AIDS and more broadly. And there I saw very clearly what you're talking about, where the focus in some countries was on infectious diseases, but for us here in the region, very much even then, it was on NCDs. So the sort of dichotomy between what the indicators are, what the targets are for Global South and Global North are also very important here. My other, when I found out from you on the plane that I was going to be on this panel, I texted very quickly my daughter and I said, aren't you working on something called the GSDGs? And she said, yes. So my other qualification for being on this panel is a daughter who's a young leader from the Global South who's doing what you said about creativity, but also saying that those targets do not relate to us. The targets in the current SDGs do not relate very much to us. We are not, so she and a group of people are rewriting them, giving us Global South indicators from a very creative perspective. The last panel talked about geopolitics and talked about the divisions in this world, so that is where my head is right now. But when you look at the SDGs, when you look at what the goals were in 2015, and Ilona, you and I co-authored a piece on this in Nature last year, when you look at the lofty ideals, we said in that piece that it was probably one of the last times that the world would be able to come together and agree on such a broad set of goals, agree on something so holistic, because the multilateralism that was being focused on in those days, unfortunately, we are in a world today where I don't think we can see that. So you talk about the Summit of the Future, it already is overshadowed by global events. It is already a footnote. How hopeful can we be that these big conversations are going to impact us all as a global community? I would say that we need to start turning these things on their heads. We've looked to New York for too long. We've looked to Geneva for too long. We need to start deciding for us in the Global South, and I'm just coming from Indonesia where there was a grouping of ministers from across Southeast Asia, and I was invited by Minister Budi in my capacity as whatever, I can't remember which capacity I was there at, as in the other day. But it was very clear from being in that room that the Global South is saying that we need to start looking at our own targets. We need to start looking at what makes sense for us. So a summit for the future in New York, you and I, of course, are very close in the link to the Geneva scene. We know that there's discussions around a pandemic accord right now. A summit for the future cannot go on, cannot have any significant conversations without discussing what that means, because what we're hearing is how has COVID reshaped the future of the world as we see it. And nobody can agree on, they can't even agree on the word equity for the pandemic accord. The other one I heard the other day was there was a problem with solidarity. So when we are in a place where we are nitpicking such little things, the SDGs, effectively for many of us in the South, have failed. I will say that quite clearly. So the answer to your first overarching question is no.
Thank you, Yodi. And it is, in a way, some people say it is the last global social contract we were actually able to agree on, and we have broken it. With COVID, we've broken it clearly, but we've also broken it on so many other fronts. So I think I'd like to stay with that geopolitical view, and why you were going to give us some readings of how you see geopolitics, not being very supportive maybe of this process. I was also speaking to the co-chair of the negotiations on the charter. And the message I was getting there also is how incredibly difficult negotiations in New York have become, and that all kinds of other geopolitical issues are at the forefront and are standing in the way of any agreement on any issues, particularly, of course, on certain issues that we're so concerned that we are rolling back, not just UHC, but many human rights issues, and in health, particularly sexual and reproductive health and rights. So why share some of your thinking with us?
Thanks very much, Ilona. And actually, following on from what Yodi has mentioned, I've always been amazed that the elephant in the room around geopolitics, it's very seldom discussed in an open, frank, transparent manner. Because when we start to look at the interconnectedness between geopolitics and actually finding solutions that we talk about in health, always talking about sustainability, about equity, about ethics and justice, actually geopolitics would come in to really mask that equation. And if we start to look at how the global governance system that we have in the world that relies a lot on consensus of what United Nations does, that pretty much has broken down. If we look at how UN Security Council is unable to right some of the wrongs that's happening right now in the world, we know for a fact that the United Nations systems is no longer working the way that we think it will be. And the question right now is, when we talk about the SDGs, are country leaders, are politicians even thinking about the SDGs when they start to formulate their own country policies? Or are they just thinking about whether they will be re-elected in the long term? And this short-termism is going to compound the worries that we think is happening in the world around geopolitics. Because frankly, I think an elephant in the room right now, probably that I will call it out, it's what the world will look like post-November this year. And if that's the internal politics within a country between two parties that is going to affect the geopolitics of the world, you would start to see that the cry or the call for countries to focus on SDGs and for countries to provide the necessary aid to help other countries to achieve the SDGs becomes very empty when giants in the world has that ability to just renegade on any promises that they have made in the past. And in this part of the world, in Asia Pacific, I suppose the geopolitical tussle between China, between the United States, continue to play quite a big role in shaping how countries respond in in Singapore, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, in Vietnam, in Laos. So when we start to think about the SDGs, I actually like to think that the geopolitics is manifesting in a way that is creating imbalances in the world that is distracting many country leaders from focusing on what is important to achieve the SDGs, because more importantly, when country leaders are formulating their own policies, they don't even have a lens of the SDGs in their current policies.
Thanks very much. I'm handing Tony in a minute. I just want to raise another elephant. It's not just the US and China. I think we have to look very, very clearly at the role Russia is playing. And, really, and not in terms of we want A instead of B, but we will just deconstruct international negotiations. And I think that, you said lack of consensus. There are, countries like Russia that are really systematically both, in real negotiations, behind closed doors, and on social media, doing everything they can that we do not reach agreement and that we are more polarized in the global system. So Yodi has a different view, but I have to hand over to Tony.
No, Yodi, please jump back in there.
No, I think we can't just blame Russia. I think if you look at my region of the world, my other region of the world, this is my original professional home, the place of my birth is Nigeria. If you look at what's going on in West Africa and the Sahel at the moment, if you listen to our leaders, if you look at Niger, you look at Burkina Faso, you look at Mali, you can't blame Russia solely for that situation. You cannot blame people for rebelling against what they consider to be the oppression of the past, the colonial nature of the leadership. People are throwing out their old alliances and old allegiances because they feel betrayed, because they feel that the trust has been completely broken. So what Russia has done, maybe others are doing, is they've identified the gap. They've identified the gap, so we can't blame them solely. I mean, the biggest...
No, but it's a geopolitical strategy.
It's a geopolitical
I'm not talking about blame.
Yeah.
It's a geopolitical strategy.
But if you look at who our historical partners have been and how those historical partners have let us down, we are now, this week, Niger are throwing out the US with the biggest drone base in the whole of Africa. The whole of the Sahel will collapse shortly because of short-termism, because of short-sightedness, because people thought we could keep saying to those of us in those parts of the world that this is how you must do it. You must do it our way and our way alone. And people have said enough is enough. So Russia and others have filled that gap. That's my argument.
Yeah, no, terrific. And absolutely terrific to have you with us on this panel, Yodi. So thank you for being late for the earlier panel. Now, this brings me down here to Selena Lowe, who's the Executive Director of the Global Health Alliance here in Melbourne. And Selena, we've heard quite a bit about health and human rights at this meeting, importantly, including in the context of the recent Lancet Commission on that topic, which has really put human rights back on the agenda in global health. You're a global health leader, one of the few with a background in both medicine and law. What's your take on health and human rights through this lens of the SDGs?
Thanks very much, Tony, and thank you to the panel organisers for inviting me. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we gather and meet. And when I was gathering my thoughts last night about this panel and human rights and SDGs, I have categorised them into the, 4 points that I'll elaborate on in the next few minutes. First, do human rights really even matter in the context that we've been, we were all at the plenary in our context, in our new normal. Secondly, in regard to the instruments that we have now, what good has come of it in this era since the SDGs started? Thirdly, what do I think are the gaps? Because you gave me this seat, so I get to speak. And fourth, can we craft a different sort of narrative going into the future, whatever summit of the future, keeping the basis of human rights and all of these gaps that undermine the principles of good health and justice. So Tony and Ilona shared with us some paper reading before this panel, and there's a wonderful paper that for the scholars among you, please read. It's published in Nature, and it's by Sharan Malapur and others, looking at where the SDGs are, and it's just incredible. The first table just shows the only progress is really on mobile and internet usage. Everything else has deteriorated. Everything from hunger to environmental issues and sustainable growth to various other mobilities. So in terms of the human rights context, this year, as you know, was the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And some of you might have been at the, I also work for the Lancet, I still have to say that, and at the Lancet IAS Commission report launch earlier this week, where the report, I would say the report puts human rights back at the centre of global health, but as an editor, reports are just reports. I mean, without a after publication life and without leaders to take it on, it goes nowhere really. The report is great in that it sets out various domains, 8 different domains to work on. And so I would say that's a really good thing to look at in terms of the progress on human rights, but also something that we can hang on to for hope in terms of our evidence base. The other thing is just to look really back, and Article 14 of the Convention of the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights actually explicitly says that we have to, as member states, we must not retract, on our progress or this so-called progressive realisation of rights. That's one of the issues of economic, social and cultural rights, that it's considered progressive realisation. A lot of leaders don't really take much note of that unless we legislate. In Australia, we don't even have a Bill of Rights, but some states have actually legislated on it. But I would say another hope is that 2 years ago, or 2022, the UNGA agreed on a resolution on the right to a healthy environment. And I think that was quite extraordinary, in our current world, that we could get member states together on that. And what that means is that we all have a right to clean air, safe food, and to live, without air pollution or without, the instability of climate change. You might think that's a utopia. Human rights people are kind of utopians, but this is something to give us hope, because groups such as those inspired by Greta Thunberg and others have gone on to do this. And in terms of youth, the future has to involve the voice of youth. And so when I turn to a new narrative, it must include the voices of youth in a way that's meaningful, not just tokenistic, ask them to come onto a panel or ask them to, report on our meeting. But if there is a summit of the future, include them in the leadership, in the conceptualisation. And perhaps when we're, talking about the gaps that we all face, that there is one glaring gap for me in the SDGs that really speaks to our current world, and it's that of race and racism. I think I would just, dare I say it, and I would say it with all respect, because the non-white people on this panel, each of us will have in some shape or form, despite our privilege, will have accepted some form of racism in our lives and also in our work. The racial Discrimination Commissioner actually wrote a report in 22 that the SDGs missed race. And I think that's a glaring gap that I would love, addressed in the next future. So my last comment is simply this. Can we embrace diversity as an asset rather than something that we're always asking for in panels, or for biodiversity? Can we embrace human and planetary diversity in all of its form and put this narrative into some kind of healing, words to inspire, our next era? I kind of feel that the SDGs need to pivot at this moment in our new normal. I don't think it's enough to leave us as is. And I really hope we can incorporate human rights in the new narrative. Sorry, I took it.
No, that was terrific, Selena, and I can see other panellists who are keen to build on that as we proceed. Now, this brings us along to Adrian Tipatu, and who is not Emma Rawson Tipatu, as was in the initial program. Sadly, Emma has developed COVID just in the last 48 hours, and so wasn't able to be with us. And kindly, Adrian has stepped in. He's also a leader with the World Federation of Public Health Associations. Let me pass to you, Adrian, at this point, because we've just been discussing racism, and questions of decoloniality have been raised earlier as well. So where do you think we're up to in this context, and what more do we need to be doing?
Look, I might just begin by speaking in my native tongue first, as a kind of a recognition for all the other languages spoken here, but also particularly for those who are part of the 400 million people identified as being Indigenous across the planet. So nō reira tuakeo ki te mihi atu kia kotoa huhu mai nei I tēnei rā nō reira ukuranga tērā horino tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. For those of you who understand some of the languages of the Austronesian-based languages, my native tongue is Māori, very familiar too, and we can speak with our Tahitian cousins and those from Rapa Nui or Easter Island, and across the Triangle of Polynesia, which you can fit the United States into 3 times. Part of the thing about being having an acerbic New Zealand and Māori sense of humour, Sila, I can't believe you said that after all the things that those people have done for you. You know, so I am a Māori person, and I bring the regards of my wife, my colleague, who's also my wife, and so she brings from the UN meetings last week, COVID, and what a great gift, NYC. The good news is she was staying at friends' places in Park Avenue, so she was happy with that. I suspect that's where she picked it up. Look, I'm really glad to be here. My privilege also to be a director of the Centre of Men's Health, University of Otago, which is our oldest university at that particular colony, as a fellow person from another colony. And so I'm going to touch on some of the things that have been alluded to. And one of them is I really appreciate that, a big circle with a cross going in with regards to New York and Geneva. I mean, all the best efforts that have been made. But in reality, they reflect a number of things. They move at glacial speed. And in the meantime, Indigenous people wait as nations within nations within nations. And so we really appreciate and acknowledge the incredible work that's been done by people here, but also all those things that happen. And actually, can I say, outside of that, as a colony, as a British colony, that was also colonised as one of the 3 most significant religions that are coming out of where one of the hotspots are. As an Indigenous person, I look there and go, what have you taught us? What have you really taught us? Therefore, when we go to the next place of a higher order in terms of this is my cube for the SDGs. It's got all of them. And believe it or not, I roll it. And when it comes up, I have a look at whichever 3 are on there this week. And I know, it's slightly cheeky, isn't it? My next tool is the magnificent launch yesterday. Fantastic. So congratulations. And I'm slightly biased because when you open it naturally to the centre, it has a double page of the article that my wife Emma did relative to decolonising public health, decolonising health. So all the things that were related to, with respect, I'm acknowledging that actually the things that have happened so far, the stories so far are really important, but the lessons from why they haven't, and the lessons from what's going on around the world, and in the meantime, we wait. Because our mandate is no matter which jurisdiction you're in, we live shorter, sicker lives than anybody else. And I want to acknowledge the place of, indigeneity is a funny thing. So there are 2 easy faces. There are those of us that have the privilege of living in first world countries like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States, those from the Nordic countries, those from Greenland, which are Danish nationals. But we only represent a very small amount of the majority of Indigenous people, of nations within nations, and I want to acknowledge what's happening in sub-Saharan Africa, just north of Nigeria. You know, the attack back on their former colonizers, creating another vacuum. In the meantime, the people that are affected the most are the people that we know about. So, it's all positive stuff really, and part of it is, the last thing I want to mention, you know, there was a space during the SARS-CoV-2 lockdown that reunited all of us in humanity, and particularly those of us privileged enough to be in one of the 50 developed countries or so on the planet, that we all had to go to a place in a space not dissimilar to the existence that our grandparents had, and to be really simple, humble, and understand that. Probably the least affected people with regards to SARS-CoV-2 were Indigenous nations within developing nations themselves, and Indigenous people within these places. They were least affected. And in fact, if we wanted to, so the World Federation of Public Health Associations asked our working group to give a response with regards to an Indigenous response to SARS-CoV-2. We said, look at NCDs. Where we fit, that's the place that we will fit, lining up as we start to understand as we work through. So, yes, there is a place. Yes, I'll keep rolling the cube and reciting those again until they become even more actioned. And we understand, because we're not naive, we understand détente. We understand the unilateral nature of things and bargains that were done. We understand the importance of still talking. In the meantime, while other people are making big noises, we sit and we wait. With respect. To Kia ora.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Adrian, and please pass on our best regards to Emma, and we wish her a speedy recovery, of course. Yodi, yeah, please pick up there. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, look, back to I want to pick up on something that both Selina and Adrian have said, but I want to bring it into context. We're talking about the SDGs, we're talking about health, we're talking about have we achieved what and how do we lead this into the summit of the future. I know I've missed a lot of this meeting, I've followed some of it on social media, so I know you must have raised these topics before. But I have to bring it home, so we're talking about Indigenous peoples, let me bring it home to my own country, Nigeria, which is projected by 2100 to whatever, 2100, year 2100, to have the third largest population in the world. Right now, we're heading towards the fifth largest population in the world. Our life expectancy is 52 years. We have over 25 million out-of-school children, the majority of whom are girls. We have the worst maternal and child mortality rates in the entire world. We have terrorism on a scale that nobody would understand. How would I say that those SDGs have served my country? Because there are, first of all, the author of them is from my country, Amina Mohammed. And all the fancy speeches, we all wear the brooches, we all, hold up the cards. How is that serving the people who need it the most? And I think at the end of the day, all of these summits of the future, all of these meetings, all of these conferences, we have to say, how does it serve the people? Because that is what it is about. And I go back to my point about the New York construct or the Geneva construct, these glacial speeds, as you say. I have been in Geneva way too much in the last few months, but it has been painful for me to watch delegates gather to negotiate IHR regulations, to negotiate the pandemic accord and treaty, to have a conversation just last week with Precious, my dear sister, who's the co-chair, about how gender is now being removed from the pandemic treaty and how there are those who don't want the word gender in the treaty. I think we have to recognize that these systems, this consensus building around these, multilateral systems, when a world order is broken, when you, from whichever country you are, can decide on any given day that, well, I don't want to obey that set of rules today because it doesn't suit me to obey them, then who are you to tell me that I have to align with them and I have to obey them? This is what the SDGs were based on, this rules-based order or internet, whatever order it is, and it is broken. It is shattered and it is broken. So it is time that we sit up and we recognize the fact that it is broken. It is time that we sit up, and those of us from the parts of the world, I will also use my native tongue, that it is a person who is wearing the shoe who knows where the shoe is pinching. Right now, on many fronts around the world, the shoe is pinching us. Here in Australia, the shoe is pinching you with climate, with fires, with storms, with hurricanes. And it is those people who have to decide what their features are going to look like. It cannot be decided for us by politicians who are distracted by the latest election coming up in a part of America. Right now people are telling me, they're ringing me to say we have to hurry up these negotiations because Europe has elections, because America has elections. But how about the person in my village of Ogotsuekiti who needs you to agree on these instruments, who doesn't care about the elections? That is what we call the cocoa of the matter. That is what matters. That is what counts. And I think we have deviated from the people. We have deviated from the core of these things that we're trying to do. We have allowed highfalutin geopolitics. If I mention Gaza in some parts of the world, they will throw me out of the room. How is that a world that I am supposed to live in, that I am supposed to raise my child in and tell them that this is what is right and this is what is fair? So those are the things I think that we have to focus on, because we're forgetting the people that this is about, and we're making it about large constructs. And that is why in Niger, Burkina, in the other parts of the world, they're saying, okay, take your world, take your rules-based, we don't want any part of it because it is not serving us. We will not get health until we look at that holistic picture. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Yodi. And just picking up on this question about, Geneva and New York seemingly failing others around the world, it would be remiss of me, somebody who has lived down under here for much of my life, to not raise the question of why is the headquarters of the UN still deep in the global north? It was established in New York after the Second World War, but surely it would be fairer, more equitable, if UN headquarters was on the equator, because it would be easier for people to get there. So, I can see why way up there. Personally, I think Singapore wouldn't be a bad place for it, but it could be on the equator in Africa or in the Americas. There's no reason why it has to stay in New York, particularly if we get a certain president back again. I think we need to start having conversations about change as we look ahead to the Summit of the Future. Why is the headquarters of the UN system still far too deep in the north?
Why don't you?
I'm not going to answer any question about moving to Singapore,
Maybe
we'll ask, here we go.
Actually,
maybe because it's funded. Maybe it was funded, so the previous president, when he declared that when he asked that question, the rhetorical question that you're not allowed to ask in America, and then they told him, and then everyone said, and he said, so, I don't think that's going to move for those reasons alone.
But one of the things is that the US often holds up their funding. They don't always provide it on time. And there is a bit of funding available in the Asia-Pacific now, because Asia-Pacific is in a very different place to where it was at the end of the Second World War.
And actually, just following on from, Tony, what you've said about Asia-Pacific being different. In my part of the world, in Southeast Asia, we are talking about looking towards the African Union, the African CDC, in the way that you're able to come together. And ASEAN is thinking of how do we get to where African Union, Africa CDC is. So perhaps a question back to you, Yodi, it's what guidance do you see in the progress within Africa in the past 15 years that would be relevant for Asia-Pacific in guiding us out of a global consensus, but towards a more regional-centric model of governance?
Great question. Now we've got three moderators, but please respond, Yodi.
Very quickly. Let's
quickly.
give Anders the word at one stage again, please.
No, but very quickly to that. Look, during the pandemic, it boils down to one thing. It boils down to leadership. And we're talking about leadership. We're talking about global leadership already. It boils down to leadership. And I mean, your own country, Singapore, you hear the models of leadership development. Everyone looks to Africa and Africa Union because in the years of the pandemic, we had really, really strong leadership. And there were many of us who coalesced around John and Kengasong then, who we then lost very sadly back to the US. And unfortunately, that has cut us off at the knees. It was leadership and it was desperation. Because when you have nothing, you bind together. So is it a model or is it a sense of being left behind? I mean, we can take that bilateral. But I would say that, number one, I've heard a lot of conversation, even in the few minutes that I've been here, around, Africa CDC is the model. Africa CDC was the model under John and Kengasong. Do not put that too high up on a pedestal, because that was what leadership does. And to finish with the question of why is, the UN doesn't move to Africa, it's about, or to Southeast Asia, maybe Southeast Asia. For us, it's about poor leadership. We have poor governance. The Abuja Declaration in 2000, I forget what year it was, the 2001, the Abuja Declaration is 22 or 2022, whatever year it was, is 22 this year. Abuja Declaration, African leaders said they would do 15% of spend would be devoted to health. Only 1 or 2 countries have done that. We have bad leaders across our country. So we have to, again, when you point one finger out, 4 pink fingers point to yourself. So we have poor leadership. But unfortunately, the world likes our poor leadership because it keeps power in certain hands. We'll go bilateral on the rest.
Right.
Anders, your reading of the situation.
I'd like to come back a little bit to the SDGs and to health, even if I have a big interest in geopolitics and the UN. But I see an opportunity here because, as Selina said, when we were measuring progress, we didn't see so much progress. The question is what we were actually measuring. Because we know what measures gets done, and that was really the situation during the MDG agenda. Coming back to SDG 3, this is about maximizing number of healthy years you get when you're living. And it's important that we increase life expectancy, as George is saying. We still have that issue in many countries. But still also in Nigeria, you see the transition that people are surviving more, but they're living not so healthy lives. So when we see a progress in the world, we see life expectancy increasing, but healthy life expectancy not increasing in the same path. So I would like us to begin to measure, to use that as the indicator to see whether we get more healthy lives. And what do we mean by healthy lives? I'm living myself with 2 chronic diseases, but I'm very healthy. I'm very happy. I'm on a couple of medications, but quite cheap, so I don't cost society so much. And I'm continuing to work and I continue to pay tax. And that's an indicator then. If you can see whether people are actually functionally healthy, that could be quite useful. And I think most countries across the world, and especially in this region, where you also have an aging population, and when you need a productive population that can continue to work and to pay taxes for the elderly population, but also that the elderly population can be both happy, healthy, but also possibly not costing the society so much. My message is we haven't capitalized on SDG 3 yet. When we are measuring progress, we're measuring the 13 targets. We're not measuring what the goal is about. And I think we need to get back there, because I think that's really the opportunity. My prime minister in Sweden, he said some years back that we were going to increase pension age to 75. And if that would have happened in another European countries, like in France, you would have had strikes. In Sweden, we did not. But we had a major comment from people saying that, yeah, not a bad idea. I love working as long as I can stay healthy. So I think there's a power in the SDG agenda. I mean, with all the respect for that, poorly understood, this is not resonating to us, we need to have local indicators, etc. But if we focus on some of the major concepts here, and I think the concept here about health, not just disease, not just life expectancy, but ensuring that we can live long and healthy lives is something that we still can materialize on.
Thanks very much, Anders. And absolutely, your point about starting to measure what really matters is critical as we look ahead. And it reminds me, of course, of the Geneva Charter for Wellbeing, which was promulgated during the pandemic and probably, frankly, didn't get the attention that it warranted.
And you can very well, I mean, when you measure whether you're functionally healthy, of course, it's both your mental and physical health that leads you also to well-being, and also seeing what is happening in some countries where they also put well-being as the overarching target for development, not economic development, but having a well-being economy. That's sort of in line with the same kind of thinking.
Yeah.
But just remember that SDG 3 is not about more health service, it's not UHC, it's not more vaccination, it's about maximizing the number of healthy years you get.
Yeah, no, thanks. And I can see Adrian just picking up the mic again. And we will shortly come to the floor because we're really keen to get questions as well. But I just wanted to also say in relation to the Geneva Charter for Health, for Wellbeing, that it's definitely worth looking at because it's a charter for well-being of people and planet. And this brings me to the point around, if you like, the notion of the planetary in global health. It has been good to have a fairly strong focus on climate change at this meeting, but the planetary is not just about climate, biodiversity, ecosystems, pollution. And of course, there was another Lancet commission that I was honoured to be part of, that Selena was actually the handling editor for back in 2015, the Lancet Commission on Planetary Health. And so, the term global that we use in our work, it really aligns with globalization, global economies, but the term planetary can be useful because it makes sure that we're conscious of natural systems, which is the foundation of all life on Earth, not just human life and well-being. So, I mean, I don't know whether anybody would like to respond to that, but I just want to put it out there.
I might just touch on that. Look, it was a privilege to be at the World Health Assembly in 2017 when our Minister of Finance in New Zealand gave a wellbeing budget. And I'm just acknowledging that because these hard-fought gains, so I want to acknowledge all the work that's happened around the SDGs, they can be easily lost. We're alluding to what may happen in November. So I'm just acknowledging a good example is New Zealand, which has led its way as a very small nation through SARS-CoV-2, but other things in social justice historically. All of those things, a retrograde step has happened within the last 120 days alone. So please believe me when I say we're not knocking any of the stuff that's happened. In fact, we're honouring them in our native tongue. We whaka mana, we give mana to that. But we're aware that without the constant drive, these gains can be lost incredibly and so easily.
And Selena, you've picked up your microphone as well.
Yeah, because you and Antis started talking about measuring things again. So that means someone has to read that and peer review that, and it has to be done in a certain time. I just wanted to comment on going into that process and also how the current and the next phase should look. Essentially, what we're all talking about is a shift of power. I mean, everybody's talking about this. And what is power? I mean, the framework I like to use, it's our networks, it's money, and it's platforms. And our networks are really strong, in public health, but who's in this room, who can afford the price, who isn't, hasn't got access to live stream, I don't know. Can the next gen think of better ways for us to conference and meet? Also, we're all in multiple meetings all the time in global health. I mean, I don't know how many you've been in, Tony, but what do we achieve in each of these? And I think we really have to look at how we work, as a community. Secondly, money. Okay, so we talk about, deregionalization. We need to be courting our regional philanthropists and investors and getting them on board for global health. And then we can move the UN to Singapore or wherever we decide that we might like to work for YY or whatever. But then in terms of platform, I just really wonder whether media has shaped our narrative throughout the pandemic. It shaped it, the current Middle East crisis. Do we need to be creating, investing, and having our own more positive, I want to hear the positive stories. We're always, to the general population of things that are good. And and crafting our own narrative that is going to counterbalance the others.
Thanks. I'd like to jump in there before we move out to your questions or comments and really take us back to the title of the panel. Because the title of the panel is, Where do the real leadership opportunities lie for SDGs and health? Now, you can say, I couldn't care less because I don't want any SDGs, that's fine. But I think I'd like each of you in 2-3 sentences to just say where you think that leadership lies. Where do we take it forward? Either it's a leadership that's already manifesting itself, or it's a leadership that you think we need to build. So if I could ask each of you to just take 2 or 3 sentences to answer the question, where do the real leadership opportunities for SDGs and health lie? And then we could get the room here to respond whether they think you have identified those leadership areas that they also see. You mentioned youth, for example. Actually, there is a whole youth summit linked to the Summit of the Future, for example. So that is something that's going on. Again, maybe not good enough, but it is going on. Actually, youth have been able to be involved over the last 5 years much more than 10 years ago or 15 years ago, for example. But I'm sure it can still be improved, and our rapporteur over there will surely have loads of ideas how to do this. But could I ask each of you just to quickly jump in and say, these are the real leadership opportunities. And I think there's a difference there between saying who are the leaders to saying where are the leadership opportunities. Anders, could you hit us off?
The most important one are the people working on the climate agenda. Those are the most important one for improving health in the world today. Not just improving for the planet, but also for human beings. 1/3 of the negative climate impact is coming from how we produce, consume, and waste food. 1/3 of the negative impact in terms of premature mortality of NCDs is coming from the same reason. Clean energy system, sustainable urban planning, green areas in cities is not just for the climate, enormously positive health impacts. So the most important leadership for me for health is coming from the climate community. You don't need to use the H word, just do it, what they are doing.
Thank you. You can go home with the H word. So, Adrian, where do you see the greatest leadership opportunities?
Well, I really appreciated last year at World Health Assembly, Tedros acknowledged the important place of recognising Indigenous leadership and knowledge. And so that's acknowledging that, we have leaders within our communities as well that can encourage a kind of an appetite for those who have other jurisdiction portfolios over that. But I'm just acknowledging that leadership within traditional societies is something to be listened to as well.
Thank you. The very, very historical World Health Assembly resolution on Indigenous health and rights, and I would recommend that to all of you, and an action plan is being prepared right now. So I think something that has not been at the center of WHO's work to the extent it is now. Selina, leadership opportunities.
I am going to expand on what Anders said. I agree with him, but I think the real leadership opportunity is for the leaders who can collectively really listen to people and put that on the agenda. And secondly, the notion of planetary health. I come back to this, which is the health of human civilization, not just health, human civilization and the natural world on which it depends. And in that is everything we've already discussed. So I think leaders that really understand that and help us expand will be very welcome.
So a new quality of leaders. Why? Where are they?
Actually, I'm a little bit more pessimistic about global leadership. So I would disagree with Anders on whether we are able to identify those leaders. I come from a country, Singapore, where we developed since the 1960s. We didn't set health on the agenda, but it was a very specific agenda on human capital development. We put human capital development as the main core of what Singapore needed to do to get there. And I suspect Rwanda, a country in Africa, is doing the same as well. They don't talk about health, but they talk about human capital as the main concern. And I actually think that I would be very traditional to say that Despite what we're talking about, global, big picture, global problems, country leadership is still what is needed to really empower the local governments and the local communities to achieve the goals that are relevant to them, that will actually make a difference, where health and well-being are the products of that difference.
Yeah, thanks for that, because also if we do look at the financing infrastructure and the donor infrastructures, I mean, that's a minimal thing in terms of, the investment within the country and moving countries forward. Yodi.
Thanks, Ilona. I would flip it a little bit on its head as well, and I think I agree with YY on the, not pessimism on the global leadership, but just for me it's realism, just from being on the outside looking in for many, many years, and now to sort of have been allowed a seat at the table, recognizing that we need to flip this thing on its head. It needs private sector, it needs communities, it needs also recognizing what you said about indigenous community. I mean, the sort of wealth of knowledge that we're throwing away that comes from indigenous and traditional leaders within communities. So flipping the leadership on its head, involving more and more political leadership, like the Unite Parliamentarians, which, I know partners very well with the World Health Summit. I mean, I think if parliamentarians and if our politicians understand more, again, around the broad concept of health not just being a siloed thing, which Anders started with. For me, the leadership needs to be not what we see it as today. And then finally, financial. People in the financial sector. The brilliance of the work that Budi, for instance, does in Indonesia, because he's a banker leading health. And understanding how, because, again, using my own language, money is the vehicle on which good deeds ride, the horse, if you like. And we don't have funding, so we're all having these grand ideas running around. Let's get the leadership from within and build that broader leadership.
Thank you. I think that's a very interesting thing to start out from, the leadership from within, and a very, very important message. So I think let's hear from you, Tony. Maybe you take over a little bit and see who wants to. There's already somebody here. I think
we've got some hands coming up. Where are the microphones?
The
do people have to move to a microphone, or does the microphone come to people? Right, okay, people need to go to the halfway point. So I think the first person that I can see at the mic, on the left there, yeah.
Is this the mic? Yep. John Jackson from the International Pharmaceutical Federation. Thank you for a very engaging discussion, but I'd just like to ask the panel to think about two rather substantial countries that have been omitted: China and India. All that we've talked about, the world orders, developments, recognition of the North Atlantic influence. Would you like to talk about how China and India will influence what happens with SDGs and World Health?
Yodi, you've been at all the G20 meetings in India. Say a word or two on India.
Well, I'm not exactly sure what the question is. I mean, it's very clear the role that India is playing in the world. I mean, if you want to read my writings on it, I can send you to my Substack. It's just that we're here for a short period of time. Look, the population size alone of those two countries, it says that they're going to, the significant. India are, to a large extent, trying to shape the sort of global South-South conversation, and they've been very successful in doing so. From a health perspective, from a manufacturer's perspective, of course, I spend a lot of time with your colleagues, Thomas Cuny just now retiring and was just last week with him in Geneva, but also your DVCM colleagues who are based in India. A lot of the vaccines that serve the global South came out of India during COVID, so very, very significant contribution. I don't think we can, one cannot ignore, underplay it. It is there. It's not that it will shape, and I think the global forces the global forces in a way are struggling with the emergence. I mean, we've struggled for years with the emergence of China, but struggling with the emergence of India and India's manufacturing. We're constantly having these fights around, the quality of production, quality of medicines and things coming out of India. But as Africa begins to grow, let me bring my own continent into the fray. We also have to be very careful, and this might be controversial for some, but we have to be very careful not to go into a second colonialization. We have to be careful that in, doing the South-South, that we don't then say that, okay, we're going to now be colonized, be it either by China or be it by India. So for me, as somebody who is, I'm teetering in the space between health and geopolitics at the moment, that is something that is very much on my radar. But you're absolutely right. Thanks.
Yeah, no, really important point about avoiding a neo-colonial approach in our work. Now, Adrian, I can see you've picked up
Just
the
a
mic.
minute.
Yeah.
It was my privilege to meet Deng Xiaoping in the mid-80s. Spent some time with him when he was going to Sichuan, where he wanted to do some things, and also watch from afar some of the challenges. I mean, part of the things around questions like this are really important. So if we just say 1 in 6 humans are in India and 1 in 6 humans are in China, well, then that kind of quantifies it. The other thing that it touches on is a xenophobic Eurocentric centricity. And also, if you come from our colonies, also another bias relative to the Indian subcontinent. And so behind some of that and the challenges are not just what's going on geopolitically or the fact that those two countries don't get on, the fact that we are biased in our relationship with what that kind of looks like.
Yeah. No, great point. And I can see Selena's also picked up the mic there.
I'm Australian. I've spent more adult life in China and in Asia than I have in Australia. Possibly at some point in the pandemic, that would make me a target for whatever, geopolitical narrative happens. So, on an individual level, it's from the wider Asian diaspora here in this country, it's been a really interesting time. But I would say that as health professionals, we must continue to act in solidarity with our Indian, Chinese, Nigerian, Mexican, Indigenous researchers who are all trying to do the same job we do, and we can only do it collectively. We cannot find or identify the next pathogen that will affect the world without exchange. And if we allow ourselves as health professionals to be at the mercy of whichever political cycle, whichever geopolitical narrative comes up in our media, we're lost because we have to collectively work together. All of us still need to do exchange, and that is my position. I mean, as someone who has seen really, difficult things in other countries, but also come back here and see commentators with no clue of different countries commentating on wide geopolitical vantage points from wide political vantage points.
No, that's a great point too, Selena, and as well as researchers, of course, healthcare workers. Because, many of our healthcare workers, many of our doctors here in Australia are migrants from Asian countries, for example. Many of our nurses as well from countries around the region. So, yes.
No, just one word. Keep an eye on the demography, what is going to happen in China. It's going to be a smaller country in the future. And I think we need to be aware about that and what implications that has for many things.
Great. So shall we go to another question? I think on the right-hand side this time. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Nisambula Vinaka, kia ora koutou. I just wanted to, of course, express my deepest respect and honour for the elders of the nations that on this land that we are standing on, both past, present, and those that are currently being nurtured in the communities here. I apologise if my question feels a bit grassroots amongst this lofty discussions. So I'm Fijian. I have a biomedical science background. I was in academia at Auckland Uni for a while, but now I work in a community organisation. So I can't help but see all of this through that lens. And so in our work, we do research and evaluation, but everything is rooted in community, and everything is for the community. So in my experience, we have very sophisticated care systems already intrinsically in our communities, Pacific, Māori, Indigenous. And in my experience, we have very clear lines of leadership that tend to come to the fore when these discussions fail, I guess. So I guess my question is to perhaps Adrian or any of you, what is the leadership that you've seen come to the fore from these communities when these 3 Cs have converged and when these things have failed us that we can learn from? What is the leadership you've seen from these communities that is already leading our communities in health and to health?
Yes, Adrian, please jump in.
Just acknowledging, things change and then things revisit. So if I jump back to your native land and some of the things that have changed since 1987 and come back again, I see the Great Council of Chiefs have been reenacted again, and the Whakambāos are back there. So that's returning to those traditional values, traditional faces. So those from Ba have regained that place, but also they would have learned a lesson with regards to some of the things that happened before. So so it creates a new organism around that. Also want to acknowledge that, we as Pacific people, 1/3 of this planet is a domain that we are guardians over, 1/3 of the planet. And so those traditional things go wherever we are. Wherever Kaiviti live in the world, they take care of communities within, along with embracing the technology, because we're not afraid of white science. Hey. So both things. Embracing the other bits while maintaining those new faces of whatever Kaiviti looks like, as an example, those who were born and raised here or New Zealand or London, or those who are back there keeping the traditional fires burning. So it's not a single answer. It belongs to tradition, embracing medicine, technology, and where you fit in a geopolitical and socio-cultural landscape.
Great, thanks Adrian. Yodi.
Vinaka Levu, and really wonderful to have you welcome me back home to the Pacific. Look, during COVID, to answer your question about when leadership failed, during COVID, I remember that I was following very closely what was going on in Fiji, of course, at the time. And there were Fijian communities who went back to 18-something during the measles outbreak that wiped out the majority of Fijian population at that time. And before the world started to give guidance on, before the lockdowns or before the shutdown started, villagers, because of the historical language, because of the oral traditions, community leaders were setting stones and barriers at the gates, if you like, of their village and saying, you cannot come here. It was indigenous knowledge, and it was that traditional knowledge that saved the islands in many, many years ago from a medical perspective. During COVID also, and I love what you said about the 87 and the Whakambāos and, back to everybody coming back, and great GCC now coming back, because we're beginning to recognize that we need it. But there were reasons for what went on when they did, but we'll get into that political conversation later on. But I know because of that, there was a lot of backlash on the former PM Bainimarama during COVID because again we had taken external cultures, we had taken religion, we had taken Christianity, and so the misinformation and disinformation that was coming from a lot of the right-wing, cultures coming out from outside came in. And Fiji, many people don't realize, had the highest death rate during COVID, higher than India, even during the Delta wave, because it was 20, 30 people a day, so per capita, our death rate was higher. And yet, it was that sense of community that enabled many people to get vaccinated. It was the gifts of vaccines from India, back to that original question. It was that initial 100,000 vaccine Maitri gift that saved those islands. But it was the traditional and the hierarchical, the chiefly structure that saved. So when the world fails us, if we remember who we are, if we remember the stories of our elders, we will be able to protect our communities.
Thanks very much. Great, so we welcome a few more questions. I can see one more person on this side of the room, but encourage you to head for the microphones. Yeah.
Naka wakalevu. I'm also Kaiviti and Cherokee Indian as well. And so my question, I guess I'm riffing off of that. I would say the concept of vanua or whenua is one that recognizes that everything is interconnected and that we are but part of the land, we are but part of the place in which we are. So to me, this conversation is a little bit anthropocentric because it's not recognizing that if we take this question of where does the real leadership lie for SDGs and health, it's really about the land, it's really about the biosphere, it's really about what are those SDGs that underpin everything, which is protecting life on land, protecting life on water, it's climate efficacy, it's providing water and sanitation for all. All of those will have resonance throughout all of society and all of the earth. And so I would say one thing that we see is we see a pandemic treaty being negotiated and we see a pandemic fund being created. We see the COP for climate and we see the Green Climate Fund and we see the COP for biodiversity and we see, the Protect the Planet initiative and the 30 by 30 initiative where we have 30% of the world being protected by 2030. We have these different streams going along that relate to health, that relate to sustainability, that relate to climate, that are not thinking about this collectively. Indigeneity and thinking about things in a holistic whanua way is where the leadership lies. If we take a counter COP, if we take a COP that's not any of those things in their isolation, but something that comes from the Global South, that unifies across the Green Climate Fund, the Pandemic Fund, the 30 by 30, all of these global discussions that are running in parallel, that's where the leadership lies.
Great. Well, that's a comment there. I wonder if any of our panelists would like to pick up on that, because it's definitely a very important point.
Well, Anders had started out with it, so maybe Anders should continue.
In some way, what I was speaking about, that if you ask people whether they are feeling healthy, even feeling whether they are feeling happy, does not sound so scientific, but the way that we measure healthy life expectancy in Europe, it's to perception. We ask people through surveys. And if you monitor this over time, thinking that you're going out to your community or where you're living in, and asking people, do you feel that you are functionally healthy today? And then you do that in a year's time, in 2 years' time, 5 years' time, and you see what is happening in terms of the trends here. I think that's a way of also bringing some of those silos together, because the outcome of what we do in terms of investing in our lands, in our water, in gender equality, etc. One way of measuring that, which of course is very close to my heart, that is to see whether people are really appreciating, perceiving that they are functionally healthy. What I think also is, just to add to one thing, because you're speaking about land, and I've used this example many times in the past, is that what drives a lot of this are also values. What do we appreciate? 30 years ago, I was working in Zambia. People went back to their farms during the weekends because they were poor. I'm living today in a very rich country, quite a sophisticated country. People today, because I also have not a farm, but quite a big garden, I grow a lot of vegetables, etc. People consider me to be very rich today because I can do that. Me and my wife, we can go out in the garden to see what we're going to have for dinner. I'm considered to be very rich. So the values, how we relate to the society where we are living. We go out in the forest and pick mushrooms. That is because people then are considering us to be rich. And sort of those values, how do we value the way that we relate to the society and the environment where we are living, I think is an extremely strong power. So leadership is not just from the top, of course, and definitely not just from the UN and from New York, but leadership is also coming from your peers. What are the values in the society where you're living? And I think that's a very strong power.
Thanks, Anders. And I guess, does anybody else want to comment on the need to move beyond an anthropocentric way of understanding global health?
Thank you so much for your question, or comment, whatever you want to call it. I actually think we're, at least on this panel, in our last comments, we're speaking the same thing. At least Adrian and Anders and I mentioned it. I mentioned planetary health, which is a field that has been put out there, but unsuccessfully, not turned into a movement as we had so hoped. But the planet is going to continue, and species will continue without humans, and it might be better for the planet. Sometimes I think this, quite honestly. And for those of us from cultures, religions, including First Nations, who are very closely linked to nature and respect, plants and animals as being living beings, it is precisely why the next era, or our current discussion, really has to centre this notion of planetary, and the people that most understand that and put that at the centre of all our economic, legal and political order. I couldn't agree with you more, so I really thank you for your comment, and hope it's widely.
Could I just very practically ask Singapore? I mean, here we have an example of a country/city that has moved from developed to developing in an enormously short range of time, from being, a very urban environment that is now trying to be a green environment. Could we, hear our values changing in Singapore? Is that kind of thinking? We can't just be an urban center without responsibility for the environment, etc. And, every time I visit Singapore, it seems to be greener. So, what is happening there in terms of very conscious policies? I'd like to hear one or two concrete things along those lines, and maybe your country/city is a good example.
Actually, it comes back to what Yuri believed in, which is country leadership. Because I talk about our development since the 1960s, and we were very fortunate to have a leader within the country, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, who envisaged a country that is defined as a city within a jungle context, rather than a jungle within a city context. So that's where he started off getting the civil servants, the different ministries, to develop their respective agenda from the perspective of how do we coexist, how do we green the country? Because prior to the 1960s, we were very much on our way to become a typical cosmopolitan, that it's very much built infrastructure. But because of the leadership and his perspective of clean water, he actually set the civil service a challenge that he gave them 10 years to clean up the Singapore River. And before that challenge came about, it was very polluted. There was pretty much no life within the city, within the waters. But right now, you could find otters swimming in the Singapore River, and a lot of life. So I still come back to the bit about having the right leadership and making sure that that vision is backed up by local action. And when Singapore, in the development days, when they were seeking support from international aid funders, they were coming in from the perspective of, this is our agenda. How can your funds help us achieve our agenda? Rather than from a very typical ODA model that we come in to tell you that this is a funding for malaria, AIDS, and specific developmental agenda, and then to build on it. So I actually use that as an example in quite a lot of our teaching, where local leadership actually helps set the right targets. And actually, if I could just make a point about China, which was the first question that was asked. If you go to China now and have the opportunity to ask any Chinese 40 years and above, 40 years old and above, and you ask them, most of them would actually say that the developmental agenda around the SDGs in China has been done extremely well because they have seen their lives improve in many ways. You talk about gender equality, you talk about water, food security, you talk about rights, rights in certain parts. But that is where you would see clearly that with the right level of leadership and the specific focus on what are the goals, you have seen China's development progress in a state that it's very phenomenal for a country that size. And that's where I still come back to the bit, Ilona, when you ask me, Singapore, our development that has been in 50, 60 years, done very well. It's a small country, admittedly, but it is also because we were very fortunate to have leaders that sets the right agenda, including around how we would coexist with the natural environment. So wherever we think about building, tearing down, clearing forests to build buildings, at the same time, there will be another ministries that would be saying, we will be planting another 50 trees or 100 trees along the way such that it's green. And if you look at the satellite picture of Singapore right now, I guarantee you, you would see that about 80% of the country is actually covered by greenery. And I think that is a vision that only leaders of the country can have. And we were fortunate, and that is actually our wish. When we think about the leadership agenda for the SDGs, I would still believe that the local leaders are the ones that will make the ground changes.
And how leaders can learn from each other, because many Chinese leaders, particularly when China wanted to reform and open up, actually came to Singapore to learn from your leader, both in open and in closed meetings. So I think one thing we have not perhaps talked enough about, how can leaders learn from each other, and how are they humble enough, as was the Chinese leader of the time, to actually say, I will go there because I want to learn from somebody else. And I think that is also a very important component of leadership, that you accept that there are things you can learn and that you can make your own society better.
Great, thanks. Now, Anders, can I just say, we've got 3 mics up here.
I just had a question.
Let's come back to the global south, which is...
Well, I had one really quick comment about the Vinaka Valivu, the comment from my brother over there about the global south and also about the Vanua. And I think it's also really interesting hearing the sort of the comments from the panel and the responses from the panel, because the concept of Vanua is greater than land. It is greater than land. It is the core of who we are. And it goes to what you said earlier, Anders, about health being a state of physical, mental, emotional. It's not just physical health. And I think that was where you were, in many ways, were going with that comment. And the fact that so for me, when I heard Vanua, it's a rising within. It is not just planetary health. It is the holistic nature of who we are as a people. But listening to the conversation and sort of some of our responses to you also helped me to understand that even as we talk about the SDGs, this is the issue with some of the targets and indicators, because we are speaking different languages. We are speaking different. So you said one thing, I heard another, and which is why you say when we have something led by the South, I would say that development does not necessarily look like a city that looks beautiful and shiny, because if you look at parts of Fiji and the marine world and the seas and that is development in its own self. What is wealth? Wealth is what you define as wealth. So I think this is where these conversations are really valuable, because Fiji has led in terms of under Frank, in terms of the climate and blue water and all of that. Fiji has been a global leader, and that is where excuse me, leaders can learn one from another. It's not about just what is shiny, it's that which will keep us healthy. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So we've got 2 more comments here, and then back, I think, to the other end for Ilona to close, so that we can all go and have some lunch together.
A leader in public health in New Zealand once said to me, sometimes you just have to legislate before you win the hearts and minds of the population. And I'm saying that because I grew up watching Lee Kuan Yew make this incredible transformation, incredible leader. And so part of that thing was around compliance within the catchment. And so he did some incredible things, really used the Colombo Plan incredibly. Nations like Australia, United Kingdom, New Zealand had a number of their young leaders come through, and now it's not just a destination place, but the university there is a destination global university. These are some of the things. He forced them to do it. There was a lot of challenges around that, but he succeeded. And one of those things he did was he was brave enough to take strategic alliances. And of course, one of the strategic alliances today is their military alliance with Israel. And so before that, it was other relationships. So that's the bravery of that kind of leadership. And he took it from what was an economic cut case to the magnificent place that it is today. The last bit is, you know, sharing our language. So for those of you, please, I apologise if it sounds like an education. So the word whenua and vanua means land. It also means the placenta. So if you want to grow leaders in the Pacific, you use your native tongue and you say, this is the land, I take your placenta and I place it into the place called whenua vanua. Whenua vanua. And it creates a symbiotic and a metaphysical relationship that grows true leadership. And then when they go on to become Harvard graduates, in that depth of their new knowledge is the traditional stuff that grounds them in that I know that the word for placenta and the word for land is the same.
Yeah.
Same
No,
thing.
thank you.
We all do that.
Now, Selena, one final point, and then back to Ilona.
Singapore is greener, but if you go back to Beijing, it's also greener since I live there. The current government is working on a notion of eco-civilization, which Tony in the Lancet have been working on a new commission on and had launched. And I only have one final thing to say, which is that we can't live in a beautiful green city and places without human rights, you know, and without... so while I, you know, respect all the calls for respect for our land and oceans, we can't, as humans, live there without, you know, our own thriving and well-being. But by the same token, we can't have all our civil and political rights while living on a wasteland. So that's all I want to say.
Thanks very much. Back to Ilona.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, to the panel for this fantastic discussion. And I think we had a really great group of people up here. Would you please clap for them? We'd also like to thank you for your questions. I'm aware that we could only get some of them in, but I think they also got this panel going in a variety of ways. We've discussed the complexity of issues. You know, complexity is the word we use. You have a different word. And I think Yodi's point about finding ways of having more of these respectful conversations, because if you talk about the relationship to land, I can tell you that there are large groups in Switzerland who have very deep connections to their land, to their mountains, to their lakes. And we need to have this conversation, how your understanding of land and the wholeness it brings is also there in other parts of the world, and how we then can build common goals from that. So I'd like to say something in my language. Was du heute kannst besorgen, das verschiebe nicht auf morgen. That's about leadership. What you can do today, don't leave it for tomorrow. And that will be my plea to all of you. Each and every one of you is a leader, can be a leader, and don't leave it for tomorrow. Take it forward from today. Thank you very much.
Dankeschön.